Hello, welcome back to Mr. Martinez's Biology Classroom. It's wonderful to have you here. Let's jump right into it. So, last time we talked about levels of organization, from atoms and molecules to cells to tissues, so on and so forth. So, what I want to do now is talk about cells. Now, we talked about how atoms make up molecules, molecules make up macromolecules, and those macromolecules are found inside of cells. The example that I used was DNA being a nucleic acid, which is a biomolecule found in the nucleus, which is an organelle inside the cells. So, what we're talking about today is going to be the difference between prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Now, I like Legos. I like to play with Legos. I bet we've all made something like this before, right? Something very simple. Just a couple of Legos all put together. It looks nice, not very complicated. Now, for the pros, right, you can build something like this, a car. If you look inside, you can see the details. There's, windows and brake lights and tires. It's much more complex. So you have something simple versus something complex. That's what it ultimately comes down to with prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Prokaryotic cells are very simple. They're like this. There's not a whole lot there. There is genetic material because they are alive, but there's no what's called membrane-bound organelles. What that means is that there are organelles that are bound by a membrane or surrounded by a membrane. So I mentioned the nucleus. The nucleus is a membrane-bound organelle because the genetic material, the DNA, is encased inside of a nuclear envelope which surrounds the nucleus. So it is a membrane-bound organelle because it has a membrane that surrounds it that regulates what comes in and out. Same as with the cell. So both prokaryotes and eukaryotes have cell membranes. The difference is that a prokaryote has a cell wall. So I picked this particularly because of its shape. So prokaryotes have a cell wall. Even though they are simple, they have this structure. Now, cell walls are important for bacteria because they help us identify them. They can be gram-positive or gram-negative depending on something called peptidoglycan on their cell walls. We'll get to that later. For now, just remember that prokaryotes are simple. They don't really have any membrane-bound organelles. The organelles that prokaryotes have are usually just ribosomes. So ribosomes are something that prokaryotes and eukaryotes share. So that was prokaryotes, right? Simple. Now let's talk about something more complex, right? Something complex like a eukaryote. Now eukaryotes are the cells that we have. As humans and as animals, we are eukaryotic creatures. What that means is the eukaryotes have a membrane-bound nucleus. The genetic code is encapsulated inside that nucleus. So just like I said a second ago, prokaryotes and eukaryotes both have genetic material. They're both alive. So one of the important distinctions are that prokaryotes do not have a nucleus. They don't have those membrane-bound organelles, like I said a second ago. So prokaryotes don't have that, which means that eukaryotes do. So eukaryotes have a nucleus. You, as in you, carry a nucleus. Eukaryotes. Eukaryotes have a nucleus. Prokaryotes don't. So what are prokaryotes? It's simple enough to hold this, but what are they? Now, when you think of a prokaryote, the thing that you should think of are like bacteria. Bacteria are prokaryotes. They're very simple, no nucleus, no membrane-bound organelles. They are simple and much older than eukaryotes. You might remember from one of our previous units about the 6 kingdoms. We talked about the domain archaea. So the archaea are bacteria that are ancient, right? They like the extreme environments. They're extremophiles. They are prokaryotes. They don't have that membrane-bound nucleus like eukaryotes do. It's thought that prokaryotes were one of the first life forms on Earth. In fact, a long, long time ago, it's hypothesized that a cell engulfed another cell, and instead of destroying it, that cell provided the original cell with energy. So in exchange for energy, that cell got protection. This is called the endosymbiotic theory, and it's kind of the origins of eukaryotes. So we'll fast forward a little bit. Eukaryotes are complex. They're not like prokaryotes. They're much more complex. So going back to this endosymbiotic theory, it's thought that that was the beginnings of mitochondria. You might not know this, but mitochondria have their own sort of DNA that's separate from the DNA in the cell. So let's talk about eukaryotes. Eukaryotes are complex. Looking at these two clay models, you can kind of see that one is more complex than the other. The bacteria, relatively simple, versus the eukaryote that has a lot more going on. It has a lot more organelles. Now, one of those organelles, the one we talked about earlier, the mitochondria, is the powerhouse of the cell. It provides power to the cell. Now, this is also not to scale. you would notice that the eukaryote is like 10 times larger than a prokaryote. When eukaryotic cells are getting ready to divide, they divide by a process called mitosis. You might have heard about it before, PMAT, or prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase. When prokaryotes divide, they do so by something called binary fission. When you think of prokaryotes, think of bacteria, but when you think of eukaryotes, think of animals, plants, fungi, usually things that are multicellular. That doesn't mean that they're only multicellular, as we learned about with our 6 kingdoms and protists. Protists are single-celled eukaryotes. Now, the biggest division between eukaryotes is going to be between animal cells and plant cells. Animal cells are going to have that kind of classic spherical structure that you're thinking of, depending on their function, because eukaryotic cells can be, skin cells or hair cells or whatever. So depending on what function they have to serve, they might look different. But for the most part, think of it like that. Now, plant cells, on the other hand, also eukaryotic, but have a very rigid structure, similar to what you would have noticed with the bacteria. That's because they both have a cell wall. The reason plant cells have a cell wall is to help them maintain their structure. Because remember, the plants kind of stay in one position, right? They have to grow against gravity. They need a lot of support. So that's why they have the cell wall. It helps them maintain what's called rigidity. Let's sum up. We've got prokaryotes and eukaryotes. They have a lot in common. First and foremost is going to be DNA. Both of these cells are alive, which means they both have genetic material. The difference is that eukaryotes are going to have their DNA encased in that nucleus, surrounded by that membrane, whereas the prokaryotes have a nucleoid region. Not the same, not protected. Now, they also have cell membranes. This helps them to kind of maintain homeostasis. They can control what comes in and out of the cell. An important distinction is that eukaryotes can be divided into plant cells and animal cells. Those plant cells have the cell wall, not animal cells, but plant cells. And that cell wall is shared with bacteria, with prokaryotes. So prokaryotes and eukaryotes both have a cell wall, but the asterisk being that it's only the plant cells, because animal cells do not have a cell wall. Both of these cells also have what's called cytoplasm. It's that jello-like fluid inside the cell that kind of supports everything. And then finally, ribosomes, an organelle that both eukaryotes and prokaryotes share. That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you tomorrow.